start with a little background about you. You were born in Philadelphia and lived in Pennsylvania for most of your life.
55 years.
Okay, before moving to San Diego recently. And worked in journalism and did a lot of nonfiction books about martial arts. And I was going to ask about the Martial Arts Hall of Fame mention. And then also a lot of nonfiction books about monsters and things that could connect with the horror genre, but not fiction. So,
well, there's a backstory.
Background.
There's a backstory to everything. You know,
right.
I did go to Temple University School of Journalism. I never took a creative writing course. I took journalism courses because I wanted to be the crusading reporter who would go out and you know, be the next Woodward and Bernstein both. And it turns out that about midway through my junior year, I decided to start writing magazine feature articles, and I queried a magazine. They said, write what you know, and I've been doing martial arts since I was 5. So I pitched an article to Black Belt magazine, and I had never seen what a query looked like. So I wrote what may be the worst query in the history of the English language. I got it back from the editor with, "Are you serious?" written in red across the top of it. It's like, so the second mistake I made was I then called him, in the pre-internet days, and said, "Yeah, I really am serious. You know, what's the what? What do you, why, you know?" And he thought it was a joke that one of his writer friends had deliberately created a completely bad query as some sort of a joke. When he realized I was a college student, he actually gave me a few pointers, sent me a version of a query that should look like a query, and I wound up sending it right back to him with my idea in that query. And I rewrote it, and he bought the article. And I wound up writing a total of about 1,200 feature articles over the years, about 3,000 columns. Started doing the martial arts books because I was building on half of what I'd written in terms of articles had been martial arts articles. So I wrote about that. The writing of the books, of the martial arts books, I wrote 22 books, several college textbooks, including a women's self-defense textbook that was used by about 35 schools across the country, a martial arts history textbook that was used in a lot of schools, and several books. There were training manuals for SWAT, for Special Forces, and other groups. So I did a lot of training manuals, and that got me inducted into the International Martial Arts Hall of Fame. It was actually 2 of them. It was the one by it was actually funded by Action Karate Magazine. That's the main International Martial Arts Hall of Fame. And there's the World Soki-ship Head of Family thing, which is a Hall of Fame specifically for people who are of a certain rank. And I'm an A3 black belt, 51 years of martial arts. So they basically, to get that high in rank, you have to not die. Because everybody else who's been with that long has usually died by then. So it's, after a certain point, you no longer test. So it's not as impressive as it sounds. But yeah, I got in. It was a big honor, black tie affair in Atlantic City, and all the celebrities were there. Got to hang out with Chuck Norris, who back when he was cool. So that was fun. And but the spooky stuff, I had a 4-book deal with a small press in Philadelphia to do books, and the first 3 I did were martial arts books, and they were my first books that were for mass market as opposed to college textbooks or the stuff I was doing as private contract for the military or police. And we hadn't decided what the 4th book would be, and the publisher was assuming I would do another martial arts books. But I said I wanted to do a book on the folklore of vampires, and there's this long pause during that conversation where you can pretty much hear crickets. He's like, excuse me? And my grandmother, who was the only cool member of my family, I came from a family of criminals and thugs. My grandmother, who was very cool, she was 40 when my mother was born. My mother was 41 when I was born. So she was 81 when I was born in 1958. She was born in the 1800s. She was of Scottish heritage, but raised in Alsace-Lorraine. So she had French, Scottish, and German, influences in the 1800s, and that's what she grew up with. So her beliefs in very rural areas. So she believed in what she called the larger world, and she believed everything: vampires, ghosts, inky punks, grindylows. She believed in all of it, and taught me about it when I was a kid. I was the only one of the 6 kids in my family who was not afraid of her. So I learned everything I could from her, and I absolutely loved what she was teaching me, and encouraging me to read books on anthropology and social history and so on. So I wanted to write a book that kind of captured some of what I had learned as a kid. And I did a book called the Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead. And it's the only thing I ever wrote under a pen name, Shane McDougall, because my martial arts publisher was afraid that if I suddenly start writing about martial arts, writing about vampires, that my martial arts readers would think I'd had a stroke of some sort or fried a neuron or whatever. Turns out that book outsold my martial arts books collectively 30-1. So he was wrong. I left that small press, and then the next few books on folklore-related nonfiction books were for Citadel Press, an imprint of Kensington. I did a 5-book series, 4 more folklore books under my own name. Interesting story. Jonathan Maberry was not getting invited to some of the places that Shane McDougall was getting invited to speak. So I was actually being, my pen name was getting preferential treatment. So there was this acrimonious relationship developing between me and my pen name. I killed him off eventually. There was a party I was invited to. We had to come as your favorite dead writer. So his name was Shane McDougall with vampire bite marks all over him. He's officially gone. And I did 4 more folklore books. I did 1 book on the pop culture of zombies, Zombie CSU, the Forensics of the Living Dead. And while researching those, I had my interest for my first novel. And so writing those books gave me the impetus to try my hand in fiction. Long story, but there we go. That's how we got there. There are autobiographical elements in my first 3 novels. There was a kid in there, Mike Sweeney, who was living a very rough life with a very abusive father. My father was a cinema master. So the character Vic Wingate, who's a real bad guy in the book, is based on my dad, and Mike Sweeney was based to a degree on me. And so I got to explore some of the dynamics of that, but also to go other directions. I knew how my life turned out. I wanted to see what would happen under other circumstances, not necessarily the ones that worked out for my benefit, because I did actually want to getting out of that environment and so on. At the same time, there was another character, Crow, who's the main protagonist. He's a little like I am, but the difference between the 2 of us is he becomes a heavy drinker because of his childhood experiences, and I didn't become a heavy drinker. So I wanted to explore what my life might have been like had I sought escape through substance. And because I know other people who had been through bad childhoods who did that. So I got to explore that. And then my character, Joe Ledger, in my thriller series, there was a traumatic event in his childhood that mirrored something that happened in mine with a girl I was going out with who was brutally attacked, and I was nearly killed in that situation as well. The difference between the 2 of us is I was already involved in martial arts, and it kept me steady, whereas this character was not. And martial arts was eventually what saved him from going completely off the rails, but he went off the rails for a while. So I actually used some autobiographical stuff as a jumping off point to explore how my life might have been different in other circumstances. And I've since stopped doing autobiographical stuff because I've kind of done that process for myself. Now I explore things that happen to other people.
Okay.
By the way, a little side note, one of my friends just texted me earlier, have you ever heard of something called steampunk? He thinks he just discovered something I would find cool.
The Pine Deep books and then the Ledger books, all of your books have been published just as fiction, not necessarily with the genre label. And so we're wondering about your connection with fandom in the field and conventions and so on. And
well, there's a reason for that, by the way, the title thing. Horror as a label has had a bad rap for a long time, largely because of the slasher films of the 70s and 80s. More people will see a movie than will read a book. So what happens is the slasher films, which are like largely misogynistic and needlessly, gratuitously violent, become the defining characteristic of horror as far as the general public knows. So they shy away from that word because they think that's what they're going to get every time they're doing horror. As a result, publishers began pulling the word horror off of their books. Pinnacle Books was one of the last publishers, major publishers, to take the word horror off their books, and I happened to be pitching right around the time that process was happening. My agent wisely told me that, she said, we can sell it as horror, and you keep your day job, or we can call it something else, say supernatural thriller, and you might actually get a paycheck worth cashing. So we called it supernatural thriller. It didn't change a word of the book. They're horror novels. Vampires, werewolves, ghosts, it's horror. but we pitched it as supernatural thriller. Now the effect was that the major house bought it, it went out as fiction, went on the main fiction shelves, and it sold a lot more copies than it would have as horror. I feel kind of bad about this because I'm an active member of the Horror Writers Association. I love the horror genre, I love science fiction, I love fantasy, but in terms of marketing, if you're a writer, the fiction label sells more copies. It's still the same book. I still promote it. I'm a pop culture geek from the jump. So I still go to horror, science fiction, and fantasy cons. I talk horror, science fiction, and fantasy, but the books are marketed by the publishers, not by me. And they choose that label because that's what will sell. Some of my anthology stuff, like I do the V-Wars anthology series, that's in science fiction. I'm editing 3 X-Files anthologies, that's going to be science fiction. I have an urban fantasy anthology that's coming out next month, or 2 months from now, that's going to be in the fantasy section of science fiction and fantasy. So I get to at least play the genre titles for the anthologies, but for the main stuff, the publisher really decides that they want to market it as fiction, because that's a more saleable category. Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Anne Rice, they're all in the fiction section. I think the Joe Ledger stuff should be in science fiction, because it's science fiction. It's basically Michael Crichton with guns. It's been described as Michael Crichton meets 24 with a sense of humor, which is not an unfair description. But if it's in science fiction, they would not have sold the numbers of copies they sold. And much as I love the genre label, I am also in business to sell books. So I kind of let them have to play that game.
I think you can make an argument for putting Ledger in horror a lot of cases.
Yeah, if we marketed Ledger as horror, it probably would not have sold enough copies for me to even get past the 3rd book. Right now, Ledger books are selling hundreds of thousands of copies each in fiction. So we're all kind of okay with leaving it there. But they are, at least 3 of the Ledger books are horror novels. The other 3 are straight science fiction.
You mentioned your wife's grandfather was an important figure in the field. I was very impressed with that.
Yeah, her grandfather was Oscar J. Friend, who was a pulp fiction writer and a literary agent of some note. He also wrote in the names Ford Smith, because he was from Fort Smith, Arkansas, so Ford Smith, and Owen Fox Jerome, and a bunch of other names. He was the junior partner in the Otis Klein Literary Agency. Otis Klein was the writer as well as agent. And that agency was the first agency to represent the foreign rights for American science fiction writers. They sold the foreign rights for Asimov and Bradbury and so on. When Oscar died in the early 60s, everyone thought that all the records from his businesses were sort of thrown out or whatever. And when my wife's father died recently, 2 years ago, at age 98, when they were clearing out the house, they found boxes of records from the Otis Klein Agency, from when Oscar ran it. And the family didn't know what these were and were almost going to throw them out. And my wife had to be leafing through them, and she recognized some of the names in there, Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov. She said, "Oh, Jonathan may know what some of this stuff is." I start going through it, and I start sweating. They're the original contracts, like the sale of Psycho to Hollywood from Robert Bloch, the sale of the Foundation trilogy, et cetera. Every folder was a different one of these things. For those who know Ian O. Binder, the 2 brothers who wrote the Adam Lincoln stories, all this, they represented him. They represented Manly Wade Wellman, the sale of all the Silver John stories. In fact, notes from Oscar asking Manly to write, he had written only one, write more of these things. We can probably get together a collection of the stories. If you ever read the Silver John, Appalachian fantasy, with the guy with the silver strings on his guitar to chase away demons, probably the quintessential Appalachian or American fantasy stories, brilliant stuff. And it's box after box after box of this. The 2 most important pieces, and I hope they're as important as they seem. Oscar was also briefly editor at Weird Tales, and he was the executor for the Robert E. Howard estate. So there are 2 typescript manuscripts in there that I am currently having authenticated. One is People of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard, which very well could be the original submission typescript, and the other is Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft. And I'm pretty sure they're the originals. So if they are, my wife's family is about to make some money. I would like to keep them, just hold them for a while. But it's not mine, so they've appointed me the archivist for the family, and I'm just putting this stuff together. One of the things we found in there, which is really cool, if you know who Virgil Finlay is, it was one of the great artists for the pulp era, for magazine covers, and he had a pointillism style that was so imitated since. If you look at Virgil Finlay, he is the most famous science fiction and fantasy artist from the 20s, 30s, 40s, the early 50s, most famous. They have galleries of his work. I found an original he did of one of Oscar's novels, The Kid from Mars, sitting with just mold forming on it. So we had it, we sent it to an archivist who was able to preserve it, and it is now framed in my house. We have had it appraised, and it's worth a lot of money, but I want to keep it. That's an original Virgil Finlay. That is more, it's more valuable than original Frank Frazetta, to give you an idea. Frazetta always said that Finlay was his biggest inspiration. So, yikes. So we'll see what happens with that.
You're kind of known both for your adult fiction and your young adult fiction. Can you tell us which you prefer to work in, or anything that, is there a preference? What are some of the differences?
The preference is whatever book I'm working on now. Like currently I'm writing another Rotten Ruin book, so that's what I'm most interested in. I'm very fickle when it comes to, I'm in love with whatever book I'm working on now. And also in love with whatever book just came out, But I don't have a preference. I love writing. One of the reasons I do, switch around is I love not being one kind of writer. When I was a kid, Richard Matheson advised me to not let yourself be pigeonholed ever, to do whatever you want. If you ever read much of Matheson's work, no two of his books are in the same genre. Star of Echoes, What Dreams May Come, Shrinking Man, I Am Legend, they're not the same genre. Every book's different. So he said, just write the stuff you want to write and then find a way to sell it. So, my first 3 books were American Gothic supernatural thrillers, otherwise known as horror. I'm writing the Rotten Ruin series, which is post-apocalyptic zombies. My next teen series is supernatural meets science fiction, alien invaders and monsters in collision. I've got a mystery thriller series coming up for teens. I just finished a Deadlands steampunk supernatural alt history western with zombies and dinosaurs. I just love saying that.
Say that real fast 3 times. Eyes keep seeing out.
And I've got a novel coming up soon that's straight horror. And by the way, horror is now becoming okay for adults. They're actually starting to call books horror again, thanks to things like The Ruins by Scott Smith and Justin Cronin's The Passage, The Strain. So in our last book deal, the publisher made an offer to my agent, for me through my agent, saying we want the next Joe Ledger book and a mainstream horror novel. And they leave it up to me to decide what that is. So I come up with an idea that I really, really want to write. I've never been more excited to write a book than this book I'm going to write called Glimpse. And it's going to go out as horror fiction. I think they're going to actually label it horror fiction. And it's going to be on the fiction shelves, but with horror above the word fiction. Partly because Barnes & Noble doesn't have a horror section. But they're actually going to use that word without fear now, because horror, and there was actually a meeting, an acquisitions meeting, and my editor told me this, and he said, it just blew his mind where this other editor and this marketing guy said, there's this new genre coming up that we really need to get invested in. It's brand new, it's called horror. And he was serious. And the other people who've been there longer are going, new? But the marketing people think it's new. Never allowed the word horror to be used to describe his works. He is a suspense writer, because he was so afraid of the negative approach of the horror label. Same with Dean Koontz. Dean Koontz writes thrillers, techno-thrillers technically. Anne Rice writes romantic, or supernatural romance or paranormal romances. None of them will allow the word horror to be on their books because of the marketing thing. I wonder if they'll change that in the future. I would love to see Stephen King finally embrace the word horror, because we're tired of him calling every horror novel suspense. His argument, by the way, just a side note, is that if you look at his canon, his works, he wrote, half his stuff is science fiction. It is a science fiction novel about an alien spider who projects the image of an evil clown, but it's still an alien space spider. Firestarter is science fiction. Tommyknockers is science fiction. Dolores Claiborne is a straight mystery thriller. Misery is a mystery thriller. So he said suspense is the only word that covers all of it. I personally think horror explains all of that too. But I use the word horror in the same way he uses the word suspense.
Just got to know, did you finish the book you were working on when you got here Thursday?
No, I still have more to do. I still have a short story that's turning into a novella. I expect it to be 7,000 words. It decides it's going to be 20,000 words.
Do you want to tell us anything about it?
It's the new Rock and Roll book. You know, it's a collection of short stories. Because of so many reader letters, we've had 85,000 letters from people wanting to know more about Tom Amora, the older brother in the series. I'm writing a story in which it's a year or less than a year after the end of the world, so it's 13 years before the Rock and Roll book, and it's kind of his hit when he meets Joe Ledger. So it's definitely one for the fans. You know, I'm having fun with it too. And I actually introduced because it's a teen series and they're both adult characters, I introduced a new point of view character because the characters from Rock and Roll were children, like little children at this point, that I actually like so much that I'm thinking that my editor is going to want me to do a story about this character Rags. And I'd be kind of cool with doing that. So we'll see what happens.
One thing you mentioned was also one of my questions here. The Pine Deep books are very, very slow developed, like compared to like the Joe Ledger, which is like a roller coaster ride with amphetamines. And then the Rotten Ruin books are the YA, but they fit together though. There's linkage. The characters overlap, and that seems really neat to me. It's like a little Easter egg thing for the fans.
It is. I mean, a couple things about that. First, the slow burn of the Rotten Ruin of the Pine Deep books was a deliberate thing because American Gothic has a style that kind of ornate slow burn that builds up to the dramatic stuff. By the third book, things are moving along at quite a clip. But it was deliberate, the pace. But at the same time, there's actually a lot more happening than at first seems that's happening because there's 5 or 6 parallel storylines happening. But it was intended to be a slower pace for the development of a certain flavor of suspense. But as I was writing the other books, I decided that I wanted to include certain characters. Once I created the character of Joe Ledger, it's the one character I'm pretty sure nothing is going to kill because he's the last guy standing in so many situations because he's the kind of guy who would be the last guy standing. So when I was writing the Rotten Ruin books, I needed a strong adult character for the last 2 books. And I figured, well, who better than Joe Ledger? He is going to survive the zombie apocalypse. But he's 32 or 33 in his own books. He'd be 65 or 66 in this series. And he's still tough. He's just more ornery now that he's survived the zombie apocalypse. And the characters from Pine Deep, I get letters almost every day from people who still want another Pine Deep book. I mean, it's such a strangely popular series because I was warned that this sort of thing would be it's a paperback original, it would be out, and 6 months later it would be gone, and then it would be done. And they've been in print since 2006, 7, and 8, and they're doing hardback special editions of them. One company they're doing trade paperback new editions of them at Pinnacle, and the series just won't go away. So I love the characters. So I started doing a bunch of short stories with those characters, tied more to the series. But then I had to do one story for a project, and somebody asked me if I would do a story where I'd bring back the characters from Pine Deep. But the story I had to do was a Joe Ledger story. So I just sent Joe Ledger to Pine Deep. So he collided with those characters. And I liked it so much that recently I was asked to do another story that had Joe Ledger and my Sam Hunter character, is a character that appears in the series of his own short stories. And I threw both of them into Pine Deep. So it's a story called 3 Guys Walk Into a Bar. And it's a novella about fighting super soldier werewolves in rural Pennsylvania. I figured, why not? But as far as I see it, most of my books happen in the same universe. It's one big dysfunctional universe up here, so they might as well keep showing up in each other's books. Some people have asked if the Joe Ledger books will absolutely be the same universe as Rotten Ruin, because clearly the world does end at some point. And I did write a story where Joe Ledger meets an alternate version of his future self. So it's possible that that is the version of the world that Pine Deep is, and Joe may have saved his own world, but we'll find out later on.
Where Joe goes to Pine Deep, he is there to rescue or search for an author who is squirreled away in Pine Deep because he has come up with a plot or written an outline for a plot of a terrorist thriller which is too terrible to be punished because the terrorists can take it over and...
Talking about autobiographical.
Yeah.
When I write my thriller plots, there's several of us who are thriller writers who do some consulting work for the government. We come up with weird, bizarre scenarios, and their counterterrorism teams run them so that they always have on file some protocol for every possible situation. And yes, they've done aliens, they've done zombies, they've done Godzilla, which I think is very cool. They say they can take down the big G. I don't believe it. But so I had given, with each of my plots, I had this buddy of mine in Homeland. I give him the plot and I say, this is what I'm going to do with my next novel. I usually like getting input from him about how Homeland would respond. And he asked if he could run it in one of these counterterrorism weekends where they have teams come from all over the world to run these scenarios. And after they ran it several times, he asked if he could have a meeting with me, my agent, and my publisher. This is a friend of mine. And we have a meeting, and he's saying things like, well, first off, they ran the scenario, and the best case scenario for them was a 40% kill of the US population. So my editor and agent really wanted to do the book, and he kept saying things like, we can't tell you not to do it, but if you're a patriot and you're patriotic, they kept referring the word patriot into the conversation like 40 times. He didn't actually say patriot act, but he kept using the word, and then the deal closer was, and we'd like to lease it from you for 99 years. So they leased it from me for 99, a plot. And I've actually sold 2 of them to the government. It's your tax dollars, then. Where, and I signed a stack of non-disclosure agreements that effectively, if I break the agreement, my constitutional rights evaporate. So yes, they can be bought. But also, the fact they couldn't beat it was, I would not have written that book anyway. Who would want to write a primer for how to kill a lot of people? So I was not going to write that book anyway, but since they offered me a bunch of money, I decided not to write it. It's like, well, a subsistence farmer. You don't want to pay me to grow crops? Fine. Well, they pay me not to write a book. And I've done it twice, and I know about 8 other writers, James Rollins is one, who have been paid to lease their plots for 99 years. I'm hoping, and I've asked, that if they ever come up with a solution for it, to at least tell me. So I wrote a short story in which a guy like that actually wrote the book, went on a talk show talking about it, and then terrorists were after him because they wanted the plot. And then they put him in witness protection, and he gets in trouble. So I couldn't write the book like I wrote an semi-autobiographical short story inspired by the worst-case scenario version of that. I love my job.
It seems like you've worked with and collaborated with and edited a number of people that are at this convention. Would you care to tell us anything about any of these projects you've done with some of the other folks that are here?
Yeah,
Dish us the dirt.
Well, actually, I've got some nice things to say about some of these folks. Gary Brownback, who's one of the guys here. If it wasn't for his horror writing, I probably wouldn't have tried writing a horror novel as my first fiction. I am so a fan of his horror. He's one of the 2 things I can say about him. 1, he's brilliant. 2nd, he's criminally underappreciated. He's a great, great horror writer, and he's done a lot for the horror community. And honestly, if it wasn't for his writing, I wouldn't be writing horror. I would have probably gone straight to science fiction rather than horror. And I got him to write a story for one of my upcoming anthologies. He did a story, I think he did a story for Out of Tune, and I think he's doing another one for X-Files. Just a fantastic writer. Tim Wagner is doing an X-Files story for me. Sheldon Higdon is here, and Tom Arbor doing V-War stories for me. And just a bunch of folks have done, I try to bring in, usually when I do an anthology, I'm editing 8 right now, I generally do invitation only. I hate doing slush pile because I don't have the time to read slush pile. So I start going after the writers who not only can write a good story, but are not jackasses. I really don't want to work with anyone that's a problem child. I like to work with people who are known for being easy to work with, rewarding to know, and who can also turn out a stellar story. And Brombeck and Wagner and the guys like that, Timothy Deal, if you know him, guys that I just absolutely trust as writers, and who I like as people. So it's a lot of fun having those folks here. I just did a story for Maurice Broadus for his Streets of Shadows anthology, and Maurice is again one of those writers who everyone needs to be reading his stuff. I love his stuff, and he edited the hell of the anthology. So it's kind of cool, being here in Context with so many people that I know, respect, and also collaborate with on a professional level. That's just gravy on this.
You mentioned Richard Matheson earlier, and are there other people that were an earlier influence?
Well, yeah, the story behind that real quick. When I went to 7th grade, John Paul Jones Junior High School, the school in Philadelphia with the lowest academic standard in Pennsylvania. Yay. And I was actually one of those kids that liked schoolwork and did well at it, and as a result, I was ruining the curve for the kids in my grade. So they gave me to the librarian for 3 years. I said, you take them, keep them away from the other kids, don't let them mess up the curve, don't let them mess up the potential for standardized testing, and just do something with them. So I was with the librarian for 3 years. That was my classroom. And think about that, in a room full of books that most of the other kids were not touching. So I was very possessive of those. With a librarian who not only was she just an incredible reader, she was also the secretary for 2 clubs of professional writers. So she got permission to drag me along to the meetings. So here I am at 12, 13, 14, like once a month meeting guys like Richard Matheson, Ray Bradbury, Harlan Ellison, Elspeth DeKemp, Arthur C. Clarke. And I met James Blish. I met Gene Roddenberry once. I mean, it's the same. And the thing is, when I first met these people, I had no idea who they were. I was reading mostly mysteries. Ed McBain was and John McBean McDonald. So the first time I met Ray Bradbury, and the librarian said, and this is Ray Bradbury. And I'm like, oh, do you write too? Moderately long pause, and he smiled and said I had been known to take a swing at it once or twice. Later on, I realized the enormity of that stupidity. But the next month, and I also met Matheson too, and I had seen Shrinking Man, so I knew who he was. Next month, when they showed up, they both showed up with shopping bags full of books for me. First month, it was all their stuff. And they were kind of competing with each other to prove which one was the best in this versatile writing. And I was okay. I went home with 2 shopping bags full of books. And I didn't see them every month because they lived in California or other places. But every once in a while, I'd see them, and they would always bring books for me. And they started introducing me to Theodore Sturgeon and Clifford Simak and Avram Davidson and so many other writers. And I just devoured this stuff. And then I met, like a year into it, I met Robert Bloch and Robert Sheckley, the same thing. And Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, by the way, an incredible writer, one of the most generous, kind-hearted, nice, normal people I've ever met, and he wrote Psycho. Which proves one of my theories that the horror crowd is the most well-balanced of all the writers, because, it's better out than in. But Bloch and Sheckley were just fantastic guys. But because they all, Bradbury and Matheson were the first 2 to actually take, time with me. Once they realized that I wasn't just a kid who said he wanted to write, that I really wanted to write, they would ask to see some of my writing. And now that's a tough audience. I'm 13. I'm giving them a piece of basically Robert E. Howard pastiche that I'd written, and I expected them to tear it apart. And they did something really important. They critiqued it, not tore it apart. They taught me, and they explained to me what critical thinking actually is, and what critical analysis is. It's not intended to destroy. It's intended to encourage growth. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Because I've been harshly criticized by English teachers who didn't like what I was writing because it had monsters in it. And here are these guys who I had come to know are like the masters of their genre, taking time to go over sentence structures. Harlan Ellison gave me a whole long lesson one evening as he was getting completely hammered. The lesson got stranger as the night went on, but about he says, it's really great. How many of you are writers, by the way? Okay, this is really great advice. He said, imagine when you're looking at your writing that you're looking at it the way you listen to improvisational jazz. You should not see big block after big block after big block. The eye should move through the page. Break up your paragraphs and sentences so the eye is never trained into robotic thinking, that it's constantly flowing. The visual look of your work should be as important as its content. That's why he was criticized for breaking up, for doing the fragmented sentences. He and Ed McBain were the first two to really pioneer this, and he was slammed for it all the time. And now everyone frickin' does it because they realize it's a really good way of telling a story. You put these rhythmic beats in there, and he was explaining this to me, and I had not listened to jazz at this point. So the next time he showed up, I saw him, which was like 5 months later. He had about 20 albums, back when albums were vinyl, of John Coltrane and Brubeck, and he said, listen to this before you write. He said it'll change the way you think. And boy, is he right. I recently had a chance to talk to Ellison for the first time in many years. He's doing some work with IDW Comics, and so am I. So I got him on the phone, and I explained to him how important that lesson was. And he barely remembered me, which I don't take personally, because I was a kid. It was 1971. I think he lied later on saying he remembered that. But the point was, I remembered it, and I told him, I know everyone always criticizes you for being, kind of the grouchiest man in the business, but I remember you as the guy who changed my view of how writing should feel. And he started crying.
Tell us a little bit about, you're working with a couple different projects that may be going to big screen or small screen. So would you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, a lot of weird stuff's happening with that too. I had started with Patient Zero originally being optioned 5 years ago. Optioned by Michael DeLuca, the producer for Blade, Magnolia, Seven, and it was taken to ABC, and ABC commissioned a pilot with Jeremy Renner as Joe Ledger and Kevin Spacey as Mr. Church. How could you fail with that? And the president of ABC said, I've got that, or I've got the remake of Charlie's Angels. I think I'd rather do that. And we all cried a little. I got emails from Spacey later on. He's like, do you believe this? Jeremy Renner and Kevin Spacey, be with that for a second. I don't care what the story was, just those guys, So the option expired, and that didn't happen. And then when Rock and Roll was announced, just in Publishers Marketplace, when the deal was announced, CAA reached out to me and said they want to represent the film rights to it. I'm like, I haven't written the damn book yet. We've just announced that I'm going to write the book, and CAA asked to represent it. So they represent everyone in the. So I said, yeah, because I'm not stupid. So then, I wrote the book. It came out, and Greg Pak, who's an editor, or is a writer rather, in Marvel Comics, who's friends with this actor Louis Zhao Cheng Chen, told him that there's a science fiction novel out there about a kid, half Japanese kid, and his stepbrother who's full Japanese. You need to read this book, because if they ever make a movie, this is your star vehicle. This is what's going to take you from a character actor to a star. So Louis emails or Skypes me and says, I want to be in your movie. And I'm like, I don't have a movie. And he says, how do I get a movie going? I said, you need to get producers. 45 minutes later, he has 2 producers. 2 TV friends of his. One was a producer on Justified, and the other is a producer was on Revolution, now he's on Scorpion, who were looking to make the break from TV to indie films. And they formed First Name Productions, and they optioned it. And at San Diego Comic-Con, they made the announcement of, Louis as the lead actor. And if you've probably seen Louis. If you've watched Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., he was Scorch, the guy does fire, and he was in Predators with Adrian Brody, and he was in True Blood recently. Great character actor, but this will be his breakout role. And we have friends of theirs who are fans of the book series, who want to be in the movie, and they're willing to do it, because it's an indie film, willing to do it for scale, just to do walk-ons. And we have fairly moderately firm promises from Elijah Wood, Frodo, Emma Stone, and Adrian Brody, who all said that they, because they're all fans of the book, and they'd like to do walk-ons, and this is a surreal. I got Skyped by Elijah Wood, and I'm still a pop culture geek at heart, so this is like weird for me. And so, I clicked Skype, and there's Elijah Wood. He's like, hey, he just pulled up, the book, and he said, if they do the movie, the character of Preacher Jack in the second book, if I we're able to get free. Could we make him Charlie's younger brother rather than his dad, and we play him? And I'm like, you're fucking Frodo. You can play a sock puppet. I don't care. So yeah, I think you could play Future Jack as a younger man. I'd be okay with that. So that was one, and that started getting traction, started getting some press. Then Dead of Night got optioned, and somebody wrote a screenplay. The screenplay is really great, but I don't think that one's going to go anywhere right now because the producers aren't reacting well to the screenplay, so it's probably going to return to me. There's somebody else who wants to take a second swing at the screenplay who actually is a moderately big person I can't name right now. But then we had two TV things happen. V-Wars, which is a science fiction vampire thing. It's actually science fiction vampires, not supernatural vampires, which was an anthology series. It's a comic book series. It's going to be a board game in April, which is kind of weird. It's been optioned for television, and we now have the head writer from Dexter as our head writer, Tim Schlotman. And I just read the pilot. It's freaking scary. So it looks like that's, and right now they're shopping it to the networks, and we're getting some real serious traction. So they think they're going to get that on TV by 2016. And then just recently, the Joe Ledger series, starting with book 5, not book 1, because nobody wants to go near book 1 because it's already been turned down because of Charlie's Angels. See, they don't admit making a mistake. They just see it as the show that didn't get on TV. Hollywood, you can do drugs. So the producers fell in love with book 5, Extinction Machine. So they've optioned Extinction Machine and the other books, but they want to do a TV show called Extinction Machine. We are in the last stages of contract negotiation, which should be resolved by Monday, and they're talking to John Travolta as Mr. Church, which is really interesting. I don't know if it will happen, but it's interesting. And either Charlie Hunnam from Sons of Anarchy, Pacific Rim as Joe, or Nikolai, I can't remember what his last name is, who plays Jaime in Game of Thrones as Joe, because he's lobbying to be Joe. He wants to be Joe, and I'm okay with it. You know? And he could do it because he doesn't take that long to shoot his scenes for Game of Thrones. He would have time to do another 10-episode series. So we'll see where that goes. And so a lot of stuff's happening. And right now, for those, I don't know if any of you ever watched the show Psych, but James Roday, who's the star of that, has been reading the Pine Deep novels, and we're hoping he's going to make an option to do a TV series based on Pine Deep. And if so, it would be him and Dooley Hill again, who was in Psych with him. Dooley Hill playing the Bone Man, the ghost of the blues player in that. So we'll see what happens, but it's all very exciting. Because I had the one show that almost almost made it, I'm not going to totally believe it until I'm sitting there watching it. But once it's actually on television, I'm going to DVR it and never stop watching the reruns. Same thing with a movie. If a movie's out there, I'm never leaving the theater.
Future projects, anything else that you want to talk about?
I am in the busiest phase of my career right now. I'm writing 5 novels a year right now in 5 different genres, which is moderately insane. Shows that I have no decision-making capabilities. I'm writing 2 monthly comics. I'm writing V-Wars for IDW, which I've committed to do 4 arcs for. I'm writing, just about finished writing the 3rd arc now, and the first arc will come out in trade paperback. They're actually doing a $10 trade paperback rather than a $24 one. Which comes out in October, which is really cool. And I'm also writing the Rotten Ruin comic, which is set between books 2 and 3 of that series. And we are in discussions, Joe Hill and I and 2 other guys are in discussion with IDW to do something really big next year that hopefully we can announce soon. And the other project I'm doing is, and this one hasn't been announced yet, I'll tell you anyway, is I'm editing an anthology of young adult horror called Scary Out There, with original stories by Joyce Carol Oates, R.L. Stine, Kendar Blake, Lish McBride, Ellen Hopkins, and everyone else who's #1 on the bestseller list. They all agreed to write stories for this anthology, and it's insane. Like Joyce Carol Oates, she was my stretch one. I wanted her, never expected to get her. She wrote a story for me in 3 days. She wrote a 10,000-word novella in 3 days, and I'm like, and her email had been, I'll try if I have time. 3 days later, I get an email from her with a story attachment. I did squeak. And R.L. Stine, who insists I call him Bob. 800 million books in print. He wants me to call him Bob.